He called it an important update. But what Americans actually got was something much bigger. A president trying to sell victory, justify escalation, calm fear at home, and warn the world that this war with Iran is not over yet. On April 1st, 2026, Donald Trump told the nation the mission was nearing completion, claimed Iran's Navy and Air Force had been devastated, said 13 American troops had died, and warned that the US would hit Iran extremely hard for another 2 to 3 weeks if no deal emerged. Tonight wasn't just a speech, it was a test of whether Americans would hear confidence or hear uncertainty wrapped in confidence. Because when Donald Trump stepped up to deliver what Fox labeled an important update on Iran, he was not just giving military facts, he was trying to do three things at once: claim momentum, project control, and convince the public that this war is both necessary and almost finished. That's the first thing people need to understand. This was not a simple wartime briefing. This was a political speech disguised as a strategic update. And that matters because the gap between those two things is where the real story lives. Trump told Americans that after 1 month of Operation Epic Fury, Iran's navy was gone. Its air force was in ruins. Its missile and drone capabilities were dramatically reduced, and the core military objectives were nearing completion. He also said the US would continue hitting Iran hard for another 2 to 3 weeks if needed. Now pause there. If the objectives are nearing completion, why is he still threatening another 2 to 3 weeks of intense strikes? That contradiction is the heart of this entire address. Because the speech was built around a very familiar wartime message. We're winning, we're almost done, but we also need to keep going. And for a lot of viewers, that raises the obvious question. How close is close? Because nearing completion can mean success is around the corner, or it can mean the administration needs a better way to explain why the conflict is still expanding. This is where it gets more serious. Trump did not speak like a president announcing de-escalation. He spoke like a president trying to hold together two narratives that do not fully fit together. Narrative 1. America has already broken Iran's military power. Narrative 2. The US still has to keep striking, keep pressuring, and keep the threat level high. And once you hear that tension, you can't unhear it. Because if the enemy is shattered, why is the danger still so urgent? If the operation is such a historic success, why does the public still not have a clean answer on what the end state actually looks like? That detail matters. Reuters reported that Trump framed the goals as nearly achieved, but still offered no clear end date, even as public disapproval grew and gas prices stayed politically painful. The Washington Post and others described the address as an attempt to reassure a wary public without fully defining the exit. And that's why this speech landed the way it did. Not as closure, as management. Management of fear, management of optics, management of uncertainty. Trump also invoked sacrifice. In the address, he said 13 American service members had been killed and used that loss to argue the mission now had to be completed. That is one of the oldest and most powerful moves in wartime politics. Once lives have been lost, ending the mission becomes harder to argue than finishing it. Because the language shifts from strategy to obligation. From, is this working? To, can we stop now after people died? And politically, that is potent. It narrows the emotional space for dissent. It reframes skepticism as disrespect. It turns a debated military operation into a moral duty. That is an interpretation of the rhetoric, not a direct statement from the administration. But here's the real issue. Even while talking about sacrifice and progress, Trump was still warning of further destruction. In the transcript, he said the US could hit Iran's electric generating plants if no deal was made, and boasted that America had all the cards. He also repeated that the US could continue striking from a position of dominance. So what kind of speech was this really? It was a victory speech with an asterisk, a mission nearly accomplished speech with a threat attached. A reassurance speech that still sounded like escalation. And ordinary Americans look at that and think, are we winding down or setting up the next phase? That's the real question underneath all of this. Because the public was not only listening for military strength, They were listening for a path out, and the speech did not clearly deliver one. There was another layer too. Trump tied the economic pain at home to Iran's attacks on shipping and tanker traffic, arguing that gas price spikes were the result of Iranian actions, not his own strategy. In reporting around the speech, the Strait of Hormuz remained central to the economic pressure, and oil markets reacted sharply after his remarks. And that changes the story. Because now this isn't just about missiles and military maps. It's about household costs. It's about gas prices. It's about whether a faraway conflict stays far away when it starts hitting everyday life. The moment oil jumps, the war enters the kitchen. The moment shipping routes become part of the speech, the conflict is no longer just military, it becomes economic. And once that happens, every president faces the same problem. You can ask a country for patience. You can ask a country for sacrifice. But you cannot easily ask a country to ignore the price at the pump. That is why this speech was so carefully framed. Trump wanted to sound strong without sounding trapped. He wanted to sound close to victory without sounding like he was backing off. He wanted to sound open to discussions while still using maximal force language. AP's transcript and multiple reports captured that mix. Near completion, ongoing talks, and threats of additional strikes all appeared together. And viewers can feel that tension even if they cannot name it. Because speeches like this are judged less by one line than by the emotional residue they leave behind. Did this feel settled? Did this feel defined? Did this feel like the administration has a precise, believable endgame? For many people, probably not. And that is why criticism came fast. Reporting after the address noted that critics said the speech was vague on how or when the war would end, even as Trump insisted the objectives were almost achieved. Here's the part people are missing, though. That vagueness may not be accidental. Strategic ambiguity can be useful. If you name a fixed exit point, you can be judged against it. If you define a clear finish line, everyone can see when you fail to cross it. But if you say, very shortly, nearing completion, we have all the cards, and talks are ongoing, you create flexibility. You preserve room. You hold narrative space even when reality remains unstable. That, too, is an interpretation based on the structure of the speech and surrounding reporting. And politically, that may have been the real objective tonight. Not to end the debate, to survive it. Not to close the chapter, to shape how the chapter is remembered while it is still being written. Because if this war truly ends soon, Trump can say he was decisive, relentless, and right. But if it drags on, tonight's speech also gave him room to argue that the final phase was always going to require more force. That is the genius of elastic rhetoric. It bends with events. This is analysis, not a direct quotation from any source. Still, there is risk here, huge risk. The more total the language gets, the narrower the margin for disappointment becomes. If you say the enemy is broken, then any future setback looks bigger. If you say the objectives are nearly complete, then any extension feels like drift. If you tell the country you are holding all the cards, then any compromise can look like weakness. And wars have a brutal habit of humiliating certainty. That's why tonight's address matters beyond the headlines, because it may end up being remembered as one of two things: either the speech that marked the beginning of the end, or the speech that revealed how badly the White House needed the public to believe the end was near. And that distinction is everything, because history is full of leaders who sounded strongest right before the hardest questions arrived. So yes, Trump sounded forceful. Yes, he sounded confident. Yes, he tried to project dominance. But confidence is not the same thing as clarity, and force is not the same thing as resolution. That is what viewers should be watching now. Not just the speech, the gap between the speech and what happens next. Because that gap is where credibility lives. If the administration really is weeks from completion, the language tonight will look like a preview of closure. If not, then this speech will look like something else entirely, an attempt to turn uncertainty into momentum with words. And that's why this important update was not just an update. It was a political wager, a wager that the public would accept the feeling of control even without a fully visible roadmap. A wager that strength of tone could substitute for precision of destination. A wager that victory language could carry the burden of an unfinished war. And now the clock starts. 2 to 3 weeks, according to Trump's own words. That is not a vague era. That is a measurable claim. And once a leader puts a rough timeline in front of the country, every day after that becomes part of the verdict. So the real story begins now, not with what he said, with whether reality catches up to it. If you watched that address and thought, this sounded strong, but something still feels unresolved, you were hearing the real tension in the room. And if you think this speech was less about ending uncertainty than containing it, you are probably asking the right question. Because this war may be nearing completion, or the selling of it may be. Either way, the next few weeks will decide which one is true. If you want more breakdowns like this, sharp, honest, and focused on what the speech is really doing beneath the headline, drop your take in the comments. Did Trump sound like a president closing a war, or like a president trying to close the argument first? And subscribe, because this story is moving fast, and the next development could completely change how tonight's speech is remembered.